The long-awaited GH6 is here, and boy, do we got a lot to talk about. I'm going to run through the intro pretty quickly and get straight into the video because I'm sure you're dying to know what's new. So let's get into it. My name is Dustin, your video tour guide, and roll the intro. Really quick, Panasonic did send me the GH6 to test out and gather my thoughts, but I am not sponsored by Panasonic, nor do they have a say on what I talk about in this video. I'm also mostly going to be talking about what's new on the camera and not so much talking about what is the same as previous models. So let's start with everything that's new physically on the camera body. It's a similar form factor than previous GH series cameras, but we've got a brand new 25.2 megapixel sensor that is powered by the new Venus engine. We've got two new custom buttons on the front and an extra record button. My two favorite things that are new is the tilty, flippy screen that the S1H has as well. What does this mean? For those who don't know, not only can the screen flip out, but it can also tilt without having to flip the screen out. It also makes it super nice if you have other cables plugged in other than your mic, because you can tilt the flipped out screen without it hitting the cables. You probably noticed too, full-size HDMI has also been added and this cool little audio button here. I know this isn't crazy intuitive, but holy crap, I had no idea how convenient it is to have a dedicated audio button on the camera body. You probably noticed as well that there is a record button on the top and that there is a fan that has been added to the body. And yes, it is still weather sealed. You can also find a tally light on the front and the extra tripod plate hole on the bottom. Lastly, we've got a CF Express slot and SD card slot as well. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of what's new. What features have been added or are completely new to this camera, and why should you consider it? The camera can shoot up to 5.7K at 60 FPS and 5.8K at 30 FPS in anamorphic modes. It can do DCI 4K up to 120 FPS in high frame rate mode without slowing it down internally, and it still records sound. Little important feature there. And it can do up to 300 FPS in variable frame rate mode in HD. You can also not only record in MP4 and MOV, but they have added the ability to record in ProRes internally. When you select this option, you can only record in 5.7K at 30 FPS and 24 FPS, but Panasonic is planning to release DCI 4K and HD in a firmware update later. I want to mention, when it comes to the CF Express card slot, you don't necessarily need a CF Express card. You can still record in most modes with an SD, but of course, if you want those high bit rates, it will require the CF Express card. Now, two of the most exciting features I'm stoked about that have been added is full V-Log, no more V-Log L. So if you have an S series camera already, it's going to be even easier to match the two images. You can also turn on a new feature called Dynamic Range Boost. I had a shoot taking a look at this feature, and man, the results are pretty remarkable. I tried to get a more difficult scenario as well, shooting a lot in the shade and having very bright highlights, and I'm pretty blown away at what this camera can do. The really surprising thing is I shot a lot of this at higher ISO ranges because my ND was a little too dark, but this image is incredibly clean. No noise reduction was added whatsoever. I also really noticed how good the shadows look in these shots. The shadows do get pretty dark, but I can see extremely good detail. This footage was also lightly graded with no shadow boost or pulling the highlights down. Dynamic Range Boost essentially will boost the dynamic range by one full stop from 12 to 13. The way it works is it does a real-time HDR composition with a single exposure. Essentially what this means is it'll take a lower ISO image to maintain the highlights and get higher saturation, then combine it with a higher ISO image that'll give you less noise in the shadows. So you essentially get the best of both worlds when you're using dynamic range boost instead of having to choose to have more noisy shadows or brighter highlights. The only disadvantage to using this is the base ISO in Vlog and HLG is kind of high at 2000 as opposed to 800 when using this feature, and it'll limit you to outputting no higher than 60 FPS. Resolutions though are not limited. Speaking of Vlog, they also get rid of the weird VLT file types that are needed to import custom LUTs. You can still use those, but it'll now accept .cube files, so that's a cool little bonus. The camera has up to 7.5 stops of stabilization when using dual IS. Here's some footage of me walking around as if I'm doing a vlog. The only lens I have for the camera is a 12 to 60 millimeter, so about a 24 millimeter equivalent. I'll have to test it with a wider angle lens to see if you get that weird, ugly distortion in the corners, but it did a great job from what I can tell. Rolling shutter has also been improved, and when I compare it to my S1H, the GH6 wins with flying colors. Now I took a look at the 300 FPS on this camera because the high slow-mo modes on the S-series cameras, the footage was kind of just meh. You know, it was kind of soft and almost looked as if it was more in like 720p or like 480p as opposed to HD. But the 300 FPS on this camera is actually really nice. The footage you're seeing is scaled up to 4K, so keep that in mind, but it is 100% usable and looks great. There's also a new frame marker option for vertical content. So if you do a lot of vertical social content, but still create horizontal versions, you can turn this on to make sure most of the action happens in the middle of the frame. They also added a safety zone marker for shooting in TV broadcasting environments. I forgot to touch on another new feature that has been added. You can now enlarge the focus area while you are recording. The default button for that is the front top custom button, but obviously can be customized to any button. They have also improved the focus transition menu setup, so it makes more sense if that is something you use often. Now, I'm not normally one that does a lot of photos besides personal things, but I want to talk about a few of the features on the camera. The time-lapse mode can still be used essentially the same on previous models, but they have now added a 100 megapixel capture mode that can be used handheld. That's right. It essentially takes 8 images while shifting the sensor using the stabilizer and then compiles them into one image for you. Here's a few photos I took in this mode, and it's pretty impressive. The video features, in my opinion, definitely outshine the photo capabilities, but for personal stuff, I think this is a really cool option, and I don't think other cameras can do this handheld, so I'm definitely impressed. 4-channel audio is also new with this camera when you use the XLR1 from Panasonic, which is very cool. You can connect, say, a lav mic and a shotgun mic and still record ambient audio. Take a look at the menu settings too. When you hit the audio button on the top that I mentioned earlier, you can change gain, mute sound, change audio quality, and the input on the fly without having to find audio in the menu. The camera also supports power via the USB-C slot on the side when you plug it into a wall or even with an external battery. If you want to charge and power the camera though, it will require a different power supply that is sold separately. Oh, the batteries. You can use old batteries from the GH5, but it will limit some of the recording modes, just so you're aware. And one other thing I will mention when it comes to the USB-C slot, Panasonic plans to add external recording to an SSD via firmware update later. So if you enjoy that on Blackmagic cameras, it is also coming to the GH6. Now for the final thing that I'm sure everybody is dying to know. How is the autofocus? Panasonic still is using a contrast-based system, but how does it perform? Because I'm sure it's improved, right? Now, I'm quite the critic as well as a lot of people on the performance of the AF on Panasonic cameras. I've had my S1H for over 2 years now. I do want to preface that I don't really care too much about good autofocus. I wouldn't have kept my S1H as long as I have if I did, but having a reliable AF is just so extremely handy. At first, I took a few test shots with some of my coworkers running and jumping around, and I was very surprised at first. But to be fair, on my shoot earlier with the couple you saw, I decided to take the risk and only use AF. After that shoot, the way I would put it is, it seems slightly better, but it's still not as reliable as I'd like it to be. I was shooting this at DCI 4K in 48 FPS, And as you can see, there were cases where it would randomly shift focus to the background and then back to the subject. There are also cases where I couldn't even get it to focus on my subject when the background was much brighter and I had to switch to manual to keep focus. I do want to do more tests in AF in maybe another video, because if you shoot at Super 35 on the S1H, it will improve the reliability of the AF. So it's possible that lower resolutions will make it better, but I'm sorry guys, the competition's AF is still much more reliable, at least in my experience. Oh, and I just left the AF settings to default, just so you know. The way I look at it though, and one thing that was mentioned to me, is that this is a brand new sensor. And the camera has been in development for 5 years. 5 years ago, good autofocus for video was just barely coming into market. Since they were developing a brand new sensor, once you're 3 years into making the camera on that sensor, you'd almost have to just scrap the camera and start over. Which kind of leads me to my final thoughts. The way I like to think of the GH6 is it is essentially a mini S1H in every way. It has 6K internal, tilty flippy screen, full-size HDMI, you know, literally everything and much more, with dynamic range boost, better rolling shutter, SSD recording coming soon, ProRes internal, the list goes on and on. It doesn't have an optical low pass filter and isn't full frame obviously, but the image quality is seriously amazing on the GH6. If you can get your exposure correct, this thing just spits out an incredible image with little effort. The only thing you will have to deal with is the autofocus. But as long as you're okay with that, there is no reason that you will not fall in love with this camera like I have. It is seriously making me consider selling my A7S III because, man, in my opinion, you just can't get an image like it unless you have it. Plus, it would be nice to have the same brand of cameras. Sometimes it's kind of inconvenient, especially when the colors don't match. That's everything though for this video. I have plans to make more videos in the future on the GH6. I actually had a lot more stuff planned to shoot besides the shoot of the couple you saw, but a lot of it fell through last minute and I've had to reschedule. So if you want to see more of those videos in the future, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell button to be notified of future uploads. Until those videos though, happy filming.